The most transformative moment occurs when Margaret discovers a letter in the abandoned house addressed to her late husband, Henry, revealing how he had saved Thomas's wife years ago. This revelation unravels a deep connection between her husband and the mysterious dog, Buddy. It transforms Margaret's grief into understanding, realizing that Buddy wasn't just a stray, but a living legacy of Henry's kindness. Margaret Collins sat by the large bay window of her modest home, her fingers gently tracing the edges of a worn photograph. The image depicted a younger Margaret and her husband, Henry, standing by the seashore on a crisp autumn day, their faces lit with joy. That day was long past, and so was Henry. A year had slipped away since his passing, but for Margaret, time felt frozen in place. Her once lively home was now a quiet sanctuary of sorrow. The creak of the wooden floors beneath her slippered feet and the faint hum of the refrigerator were the only sounds that punctuated the stillness. Outside, the gray sky wept softly, mirroring Margaret's own unspoken grief. Margaret's days followed a predictable rhythm, one that offered little comfort. Mornings began with a single cup of coffee, brewed just as Henry had liked it. Though she no longer enjoyed its taste, she would sit by the window, as she always did, gazing out at the world she no longer felt part of. Occasionally a neighbor walking their dog would wave, and Margaret would manage a faint smile in return. But her heart wasn't in it. Afternoons were spent tending to the small garden Henry had loved. She trimmed the hedges, watered the daisies, and pulled weeds, though the garden seemed to lack its former vibrance without Henry's touch. Evenings were the hardest. The silence became oppressive, and the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece seemed louder, each tick reminding her of time slipping by. Time she could no longer share with her husband. Friends and family had tried to help. They called, visited, and encouraged her to join community events or take up hobbies, but Margaret remained steadfast in her solitude. Moving on felt like a betrayal to Henry's memory, as if letting go of the pain meant letting go of him. The rain began in the late afternoon, gentle at first, but growing heavier as the hours passed. By dusk, it was a steady downpour, the kind that made the world outside seemed distant and blurred. Margaret lit a candle on the coffee table and curled up on the couch with an old blanket. She had planned to reread one of Henry's favorite novels, but her mind kept wandering to the photograph on the mantel. It was then, amidst the rain's rhythmic tapping against the window, that Margaret heard it, a faint scratching sound at the front door. At first, she thought it might be a tree branch blown by the wind, but the sound persisted, insistent and urgent. Reluctantly, she rose from the couch and approached the door. The scratching stopped, replaced by a soft whimper. Margaret's heart quickened. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but darkness and the rain cascading down the porch steps. Still, the whimpering continued. She opened the door cautiously, and there he was, a scruffy, soaking wet dog, with matted fur and a broken collar hanging loosely around his neck. His eyes, wide and pleading, met Margaret's. The poor creature was trembling, his tail tucked firmly between his legs. Margaret hesitated, her hand gripping the doorknob tightly. She wasn't a dog person, and the thought of taking in a stray seemed overwhelming. Yet, something about the dog's pitiful state pulled at her heartstrings. He looked so vulnerable, so lost, feeling she knew all too well. The dog took a cautious step forward, his paws leaving muddy prints on the porch. He whimpered again, a sound that seemed to echo Margaret's own sorrow. She sighed heavily, her resolve weakening. "All right," she muttered under her breath. "Come in." The dog stepped inside hesitantly, shaking himself vigorously and spraying droplets of rainwater everywhere. Margaret grabbed an old towel from the hall closet and crouched down to dry him off. He stood still, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. The dog's presence changed the atmosphere of Margaret's home almost immediately. Though she had intended to let him stay only for the night, her heart softened as she watched him curl up on an old rug by the fireplace. He seemed so content, so trusting, despite whatever hardships had led him to her door. That first night, Margaret couldn't help but check on him multiple times. Each time, she found him fast asleep, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house didn't feel entirely empty. The next morning, Margaret searched the dog's collar for any identification but found only the remnants of a tag that had long since worn away. She posted notices around the neighborhood and contacted the local animal shelter, but no one came forward to claim him. Days turned into weeks, and the dog, whom Margaret tentatively named Buddy, became a fixture in her life. He followed her everywhere, from the kitchen to the garden, always eager to be by her side. His playful antics brought a smile to her face, something she hadn't done in a long time. Buddy's arrival marked the beginning of a slow, unexpected healing process for Margaret. Taking care of him gave her days a renewed sense of purpose. She found herself talking to him as if he could understand her, sharing stories about Henry and confiding in him about her struggles. Buddy would tilt his head, his expressive eyes full of empathy, and Margaret found comfort in his silent companionship. One evening, as they sat together by the fireplace, Margaret found herself laughing, really laughing for the first time in months. Buddy had been chasing his tail in circles, only to trip over his own paws and tumble onto the rug. The sound of her own laughter startled her, but it also felt liberating, as if a small part of her burden had lifted. Margaret began venturing out more, taking Buddy on long walks around the neighborhood. The fresh air and the simple joy of watching Buddy explore the world around him made her feel alive in a way she hadn't since Henry's passing. Neighbors who had barely seen Margaret over the past year now stopped to chat, drawn by Buddy's friendly demeanor. Though Margaret's grief didn't disappear overnight, it no longer consumed her. Buddy had given her a reason to look forward to each day, a reminder that life, though fragile and unpredictable, still held moments of beauty and connection. One rainy evening, not unlike the night Buddy had first appeared, Margaret sat by the window once again. This time, she wasn't holding the photograph of Henry. Instead, Buddy was curled up at her feet, his head resting on her slippered toes. She watched the rain with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Henry's memory remained a cherished part of her life, but Margaret no longer felt trapped by it. She had found a way to honor his legacy while also embracing the unexpected blessings that life continued to offer. As the rain softened to a gentle drizzle, Margaret leaned down to stroke Buddy's fur. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice tinged with gratitude. Buddy looked up at her, his tail wagging softly, as if to say, "You're welcome." In that quiet moment, surrounded by the warmth of her home and the loyal presence of her new companion, Margaret realized that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means finding the courage to let love back into your life, even when it arrives in the most unexpected of forms. The quiet companionship of the scruffy dog, now a part of Margaret Collins' life, had started to shift the atmosphere in her home. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. The once silent rooms of the house now carried the soft patter of his paws, the occasional wag of his tail brushing against furniture, and his gentle snores as he napped. Though it hadn't been planned, Margaret realized she had taken him in, not only into her home, but into her heart. Margaret had avoided naming the dog at first. She had told herself it was temporary, that he would return to whoever had lost him. But as days turned into weeks and no one came forward, the thought of him leaving began to feel unbearable. One afternoon, as she stood in the garden pulling weeds, the dog followed her every move, his scruffy tail wagging excitedly whenever she glanced his way. "You need a name," Margaret said aloud, her voice thoughtful. The dog tilted his head as though considering her words. Margaret leaned against the spade in her hand, watching him as he sniffed at a patch of daisies. She thought of Henry and the little nicknames he'd given her. Over the years, he had always called her Buddy in his warm, teasing way, especially when she'd done something silly, like misplacing her glasses or burning the toast. The memory brought a wistful smile to her face. "Buddy," she said softly, testing the name. The dog's ears perked up, and he turned toward her, his tail wagging furiously. It was as if he understood, as if the name belonged to him all along. "Buddy it is," Margaret said, chuckling. She knelt to pat his head, her hands sinking into his scruffy fur. "You're my little buddy now." Naming him was an act of ownership, a quiet admission that he wasn't just passing through her life. He was here to stay, or at least she hoped so. The days took on a new rhythm with Buddy around. Mornings were no longer spent in silence. They began with Buddy's eager face at the foot of her bed, his tail thumping against the floor as if to say, "Let's start the day." Margaret would chuckle, roll out of bed, and fix him a bowl of food before brewing her own coffee. Watching him eat with such enthusiasm brought her an unexpected sense of joy. Caring for Buddy gave Margaret's life a purpose she hadn't realized she was missing. She found herself talking to him as though he were a trusted confidant, his bright eyes and attentive demeanor encouraging her to share. At first, her words were hesitant, but as days passed, the conversations flowed more freely. "You'd have liked Henry," she said one evening as they sat by the fireplace. Buddy lay curled at her feet, his head resting on her slippered toes. He had a way of making everyone feel special. And oh, the stories he'd tell always had me laughing. Margaret's voice softened as she continued. "I miss him, you know, every single day. But I think he'd be glad you're here. He always said I needed a friend to keep me company." Buddy's tail gave a soft wag, and Margaret chuckled. "Maybe you do understand me." The act of speaking aloud, of reminiscing, felt like a release. It didn't erase the grief, but it dulled its sharp edges. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt like she was moving forward, not forgetting Henry, but carrying his memory in a way that didn't weigh her down. One drizzly afternoon, Margaret decided to give Buddy a proper grooming. His fur, though endearing, had become tangled and matted in places. She set up a small station in the kitchen with a pair of scissors, a brush, and a basin of warm water. Buddy seemed to sense her intent, and, after an initial bout of hesitation, sat patiently as she worked. As Margaret brushed through his fur, her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic beneath the tangle. Frowning, she parted the fur around his neck to reveal the remnants of a tag dangling from his broken collar. It was scratched and worn, the writing barely legible. Margaret squinted, holding it closer to the light. There, etched faintly, was a name, Max, and what appeared to be an address. The numbers and letters were faded, but they were enough to spark a flicker of recognition. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Someone had loved this dog once, enough to give him a name and a home. She traced the engraving. With her thumb, her thoughts racing, she looked down at Buddy, who gazed up at her with trusting eyes, his tail wagging slightly as though to reassure her. The thought of losing him, of finding his rightful owner and saying goodbye, filled her with an ache she wasn't prepared for. But wasn't it the right thing to do? Margaret wrestled with the question as she set the tag aside and continued grooming him. She had always prided herself on doing what was right, but this decision felt impossibly hard. Buddy had become a part of her life, filling a void she hadn't realized could ever be filled. That evening, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the tag in her hand. She stared at the faint address, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Was it nearby? Was his original owner still looking for him? The questions loomed over her, and the fear of the answers gripped her heart. Buddy, as if sensing her turmoil, trotted over and rested his head on her lap. Margaret smiled faintly, running her fingers through his fur. "What am I going to do, Buddy?" she murmured. He responded with a soft sigh. his warm presence, grounding her. The days that followed were tinged with a new tension. Margaret couldn't bring herself to act on the clue, not yet. She tucked the tag away in a drawer, telling herself she needed time to think. Every time she looked at Buddy, the thought of losing him felt unbearable. Yet, a part of her knew that the mystery of his past couldn't be ignored forever. As she walked through the garden one crisp morning, Buddy bounding ahead of her, Margaret allowed herself to imagine what life might have been like before he arrived at her door. Had he belonged to a family with children who adored him? Had he been lost in some tragic accident or abandoned by someone who couldn't care for him anymore? The questions only deepened her bond with him. She felt a fierce protectiveness for Buddy, as though he had chosen her as much as she had chosen him. Whatever his past, he was hers now, or at least she hoped he could be. In the quiet moments, Margaret found herself praying for guidance, something she hadn't done often since Henry's passing. "Help me do the right thing," she whispered one night as she lay in bed, Buddy curled up on the rug beside her. The answer didn't come immediately, but Margaret felt a small sense of peace in the act of asking. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to face it with courage, just as she had faced so many challenges before. The uncertainty surrounding Buddy's past didn't dampen their growing bond. If anything, it made their time together feel more precious. Margaret began to notice the little things about him, the way his ears perked up at the sound of birds in the garden, the way he seemed to smile when she scratched behind them, and the way he waited patiently by the door every evening for their walk. Each day with Buddy felt like a gift, a reminder that even in the midst of loss, life had a way of offering unexpected blessings. Margaret didn't know what the next chapter of their story would hold, but for now, she was content to hold on to the present moment and the quiet joy it brought. The decision to act on the clue took Margaret several restless nights. Each time she looked at Buddy, her heart ached at the thought of finding his original owner. Yet, the mystery surrounding his past gnawed at her curiosity. She had to know. On a bright yet chilly morning, Margaret retrieved the faded tag from the drawer, where she had hidden it. Holding it up to the light, she deciphered the faint address once more. It was somewhere on the outskirts of town, a place she hadn't visited in years. Buddy, sensing her energy, wagged his tail and trotted beside her as she prepared to leave. She knelt down and cupped his scruffy face in her hands. "We're going to figure this out," she said softly. "But no matter what, you'll always have a place here with me." His tail wagged harder, as though he understood her promise. With a deep breath, Margaret pocketed the tag, grabbed her coat, and set off toward the unknown. The drive was longer than Margaret expected, taking her beyond the familiar streets of her small town. As she moved further from home, the surroundings became more rural, the landscape dotted with fields and patches of dense forest. The narrow road eventually gave way to gravel, and Margaret slowed as her car bounced along the uneven path. Finally, she reached the address. Her heart sank as she took in the sight before her. The house, or what remained of it, was a shadow of its former self. The roof sagged precariously, the windows were shattered, and ivy had claimed most of the walls. The air felt heavy, as if the place held onto its memories with a ghostly grip. Margaret hesitated before stepping out of the car. She glanced at Buddy, who sat in the passenger seat, his ears perked up and eyes alert. "Well, this is it," she murmured, more to herself than him. Buddy whined softly, as though urging her forward. Margaret tightened her coat against the chill and approached the house, her footsteps crunching on the overgrown path. As she stood before the crumbling structure, Margaret noticed a faint movement from the neighboring property. An elderly man, bundled in a thick sweater and scarf, was tending to a small garden. Spotting her, he straightened and called out, "Looking for someone?" Margaret hesitated, then waved. "I'm not sure, actually. Do you know anything about this house?" The man set down his tools and ambled toward her, his gait slow but steady. When he reached her, he squinted at the house, a look of melancholy crossing his weathered face. That old place? It's been abandoned for years. Belonged to a fellow named Thomas Gray. Margaret's curiosity piqued. Thomas Gray? Do you know what happened to him? The man nodded, his expression tinged with sadness. Thomas used to live here with his wife, Eleanor. They were a quiet couple, kept to themselves mostly. But when Eleanor passed, well, Thomas wasn't the same. He disappeared not long after her funeral, just up and vanished. Margaret's heart tightened. The story felt hauntingly familiar. Do you think he's still alive? She asked. The man shrugged. Hard to say. Some folks think he left town to start over. Others say he couldn't bear to stay here without her. All I know is that house has been empty ever since. She glanced back at the dilapidated building, her mind swirling with questions. Could Buddy have belonged to Thomas? The timing seemed right if Thomas had left years ago. Perhaps Buddy had been left behind or lost during the chaos. The man's voice interrupted her thoughts. You don't look like the type to wander out here for no reason. What brings you to this place? Margaret hesitated, then pulled the tag from her pocket and showed it to him. This dog showed up at my door a few weeks ago. His collar had this address on it. The man studied the tag, then looked at Buddy, who stood by Margaret's side, tail wagging hesitantly. Well, he muttered. Could be Thomas's dog, I suppose. He always had a soft spot for strays. Took in a few over the years. Margaret's breath caught. The possibility felt both exciting and unnerving. Do you remember the names of any of his dogs? She asked. The man shook his head. It's been too long. But if that dog's from here, he might be the last piece of Thomas's story. As Margaret drove home, the weight of the encounter pressed on her. The story of Thomas Gray lingered in her mind, intertwining with her own. Like Thomas, Margaret had felt the void of losing a spouse, the ache of a home once filled with love now echoing with silence. She understood all too well the impulse to retreat from the world, to disappear into grief. Buddy, lying curled up in the passenger seat, seemed to sense her mood. He nudged her arm with his nose, and she reached over to stroke his fur. What do you think, Buddy? She murmured. Do you remember him? Did he love you the way I do? The dog's eyes met hers, and for a moment, Margaret felt an unspoken bond between them. Whether or not Buddy had been Thomas's, he was hers now. But the mystery of his past refused to be ignored. There were too many questions, too many pieces of the puzzle yet to be uncovered. Over the following days, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she and Thomas were connected in some inexplicable way. She found herself poring over old newspapers at the library, searching for any mention of him or his disappearance. The articles she found were sparse, offering only fragments of his story: a grieving widower, a man consumed by loss, and a quiet departure that left no trace. The more she learned, the more Margaret saw herself in Thomas. It was as though she were looking into a mirror, seeing a version of herself that might have been if Buddy hadn't shown up at her door. The thought chilled her. Had Thomas found peace wherever he was? Or was he still out there, carrying his grief like a shadow? Margaret also noticed changes in Buddy. He seemed more alert, his behavior shifting subtly, as though the visit to the house had stirred something in him. He would occasionally sit by the front door, staring out as if waiting for someone. It broke Margaret's heart to think that he might still be searching for his original owner. Margaret knew she couldn't stop now. The mystery had taken root in her heart, compelling her to seek answers, not just for Buddy, but for herself. She began reaching out to people in town who might have known Thomas, hoping to piece together the fragments of his story. At the same time, she found solace in Buddy's presence. He remained her constant companion, grounding her in the present even as she delved into the past. Together, they walked the path of discovery, their bond growing stronger with each step. And as Margaret stood at her window one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, she felt a glimmer of hope. The search for answers was far from over, but it had already begun to change her. It was as if Thomas's story, Buddy's journey, and her own grief were all threads in a tapestry she had yet to fully understand. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt alive, not just surviving, but truly living. The search for the past had opened a door to the future, and she was ready to walk through it, hand in paw with Buddy by her side. The air was thick with dust and the weight of years as Margaret stood at the threshold of the abandoned house, her heart pounding with anticipation. The discovery of Buddy's origins had left her with more questions than answers, and now she was ready to confront whatever secrets the house might hold. Buddy, ever the loyal companion, padded ahead of her, tail wagging slightly as if encouraging her to follow. The house creaked and groaned under the weight of time, its walls sagging in places, as though the very structure was weary of bearing the burden of memories long since abandoned. Margaret hesitated at first, but her desire for answers overpowered her apprehension. She took a step forward, the floorboards beneath her creaking in protest, and slowly made her way deeper into the house. Buddy was already moving through the shadows, his eyes gleaming in the dim light that filtered in through the cracked windows. He led her to the farthest corner of the room, near what was once a hearth, but was now little more than a pile of broken stone and decaying wood. Margaret knelt down, following Buddy's nose as he nudged at a loose floorboard. With a steady hand, she pried it up, revealing a small, weathered box hidden beneath. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the box, its edges worn smooth by years of neglect. She carefully set it on the ground and opened the lid. Inside were several letters, bound together with a fraying ribbon and a few black and white photographs. The images, though faded, captured moments of life long past. A younger Thomas and his wife, Helen, standing together by a lake, their smiles bright against the backdrop of a simpler time. There were photos of their wedding, of family gatherings, and of a life that had been lost to time. Margaret's eyes lingered on one photograph in particular. In it, Thomas stood next to a man she immediately recognized, Henry. Her heart skipped a beat. She had never seen this photo before, but there, in the frame, was her late husband, smiling beside Thomas in what appeared to be a casual, unposed moment. It was a striking image, one that seemed to bridge the gap between her world and the mysterious life of Thomas Gray. Margaret felt a knot tighten in her chest. She turned her attention back to the letters, sorting through them carefully. Her fingers brushed over a faded envelope, its edges frayed with age. She pulled it out, scanning the name on the front. Her breath caught in her throat. The letter was addressed to Henry. Margaret's heart raced as she carefully opened the envelope, her mind spinning with questions. Why had Henry never mentioned Thomas? Why hadn't he spoken of this connection, this mysterious letter? She unfolded the paper, the ink, faded but still legible, and began to read. Dear Henry, I hope this letter finds you in good health, though I fear the time it took for me to write it will not ease the burden of my gratitude. I have thought long and hard about how best to express my thanks to you, but words seem inadequate. It was you who saved my wife, Helen, all those years ago when that terrible car accident occurred. You risked your life to pull her from the wreckage, and in doing so, you saved both of us. I wish I could have done more, but in the end, I was helpless, unable to prevent the tragedy from unfolding before me. I have carried that weight with me ever since. Helen has been in recovery, though I fear she may never be the same. The accident changed her, as it did me, but I will forever be indebted to you for your kindness. I hope that one day we might meet again and that I can find some way to repay you for the life you gave us both. Yours sincerely, Thomas Gray. The letter hung heavy in Margaret's hands. She read it again, then again, as if she could extract more meaning from the words with each reading. The connection between Thomas and Henry was now undeniable, but it raised more questions than it answered. Her mind raced. How could Henry have never mentioned this to her? How could he have kept such a significant event in his past hidden from her? Margaret's chest tightened with a combination of disbelief, hurt, and a growing sense of betrayal. Why had Henry never spoken of Thomas's gratitude? They had never discussed any car accidents, much less one in which Henry had been involved in saving someone's life. The letter painted a picture of two men bound by a shared experience, a connection forged in a moment of tragedy. Yet Henry had never seen fit to mention it, not even in passing. Margaret's eyes shifted to Buddy, who was lying by her feet, his head tilted as if he sensed her confusion. Could it be that the dog, Buddy, was somehow the last link to a past Henry had left behind? A past that had now reemerged, shrouded in mystery and unanswered questions. The weight of the moment settled over her like a heavy fog. Margaret sat back on the floor, the letters spread before her, their contents still fresh in her mind. She felt torn, caught between the memories of the life she had shared with Henry and the unsettling realization that he had kept something from her. Something important. Her hands trembled as she touched the photographs of Thomas and Helen, her mind racing through 100 possibilities. She had always thought she knew Henry, his every mannerism, his laughter, the way he held her close in the quiet of their evenings. But now Margaret wondered how well she had really known him at all. Had he been hiding pieces of his past, buried beneath layers of their life together? And why had he never spoken of Thomas, of the accident, or the bond they had shared? Margaret's grief, which had always been a steady undercurrent in her life since Henry's death, was now joined by a new, more bitter feeling, confusion. Had her husband, the man she had loved so deeply, truly kept secrets from her? Was their life together built on foundations of truth, or had there been more hidden beneath the surface than she had ever imagined? Her thoughts swirled, each one competing for dominance. She thought of Henry's quiet manner, of his stoic nature, and of how he had always been so careful with his words. It wasn't like him to keep things from her. Yet here was undeniable proof of a relationship with Thomas, one she knew nothing about. What had Henry been protecting her from? Or was it something else, something darker, that had driven him to conceal the truth? Margaret's resolve began to harden. She could not leave this mystery unresolved, not with so many questions still hanging in the air. She had to understand the truth, not just for herself, but for Henry's memory and for Buddy, who had so mysteriously entered her life. The more she learned, the more she felt an undeniable pull toward discovering the answers, no matter where they might lead. Buddy stirred at her side, his tail gently tapping against the floor, and Margaret reached down to scratch his head. "We'll figure this out, won't we, Buddy?" she whispered. "We'll uncover the truth together." As she stood up, gathering the letters and photographs into a small pile, Margaret knew her journey had only just begun. The past had a way of revealing itself when least expected, and it seemed that, for better or worse, she was now tangled in a story that was far larger than she had ever imagined. The road ahead was uncertain, but Margaret was ready to walk it. The answers she sought were buried deep within the past, and it was time for her to uncover them. The morning was cool and crisp, with a haze of fog rolling across the town. Margaret had made up her mind. She would find Thomas. The mystery surrounding Buddy had consumed her every thought, and with each passing day, the questions multiplied. How had Buddy come into her life so suddenly, and why did the story of Thomas and Henry feel so intimately tied to her own grief? She needed answers, and she was determined to get them, no matter where the search led. She had spent the past few days trying to track down Thomas, following up on a vague lead from the neighbor she had spoken to earlier. After several phone calls, she had finally located him. Thomas Gray was living in a nearby care facility. The news hit Margaret like a weight in her chest. She had pictured him as someone lost in time, a ghost of the past, but now she knew where he was, and he had a story to share, a story that could explain everything. The care facility was a quiet place, tucked away on the outskirts of town, surrounded by manicured gardens and rows of hedges. Margaret's footsteps echoed in the long, sterile hallways as she walked to the designated room. Buddy at her side. She had decided to bring him along, believing that his presence might offer some comfort to Thomas. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew that Buddy had already proven to be more than just a dog. He was a bridge to something much larger. When Margaret knocked on the door and entered, she found Thomas sitting by the window, his eyes distant, gazing out over the garden. He was a frail man. Now, his once broad shoulders hunched with age, his face lined with years of hardship and sorrow. But there was still a spark in his eyes, a trace of the man he had been long ago. "Hello, Thomas," Margaret said softly, stepping into the room. His gaze shifted slowly toward her, and for a moment, he seemed confused though he couldn't quite place her. But then something in his eyes changed, a flicker of recognition, and he smiled warmly, though faintly. "You must be Margaret," he said, his voice raspy but gentle. "I've been expecting you." Margaret took a seat across from him, her hands clasped in her lap. She nodded, offering him a small smile. I found something. Some letters, photographs. I didn't know what to make of them at first, but they led me here. To you?" Thomas's gaze softened as he listened, and for a moment there was silence. The weight of the conversation hung between them, and Margaret could feel the depth of the moment settling in. She wasn't sure how to start or what to say, but she knew she had to ask the question that had been burning in her mind for days. "Thomas," she began cautiously, "I need to understand. How did Buddy come into my life? Why did he come to me?" The question hung in the air, fragile and heavy, and Thomas took a slow breath before answering. "Buddy wasn't always your dog," he said quietly, his voice tinged with sorrow. "He was Helen's dog. She loved him dearly." Margaret blinked, processing the information. She had always assumed Buddy was a stray, just another dog that had wandered into her life by chance. But now, as Thomas spoke, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "When Helen passed," Thomas continued, his voice trembling slightly, "Buddy ran away. He couldn't bear it, I suppose. He searched for her, but he never found her. I tried to comfort him, but the house was too quiet, too empty. After months of searching for him, I decided to let him go, to let him find his way, wherever that might be." Margaret felt a pang of sympathy for Thomas. She could see how much he had loved his wife, how deeply her death had affected him. But there was more to the story. She knew it. There had to be more. "Buddy came to me that rainy evening," Margaret said, her voice soft. "I didn't know what to make of it, but when I saw him, something about him felt familiar. It was like he had been waiting for me." Thomas's eyes widened slightly, a knowing look crossing his face. "Helen's death took a toll on me, Margaret," he said, his voice growing distant as he looked out the window again. "It was Henry who saved her that day. It was Henry who pulled her from the wreckage of that car crash and gave her a second chance. And after that, I didn't know how to thank him. I didn't know what to say or how to repay him for the gift he gave me. I was lost, broken, and when I heard that Henry had passed, I didn't know how to cope with the weight of it all." Margaret listened closely, her heart heavy with emotion. "But you did something, didn't you?" she asked gently. Thomas nodded slowly, the sorrow in his eyes deepening. "I adopted Buddy after that. I couldn't explain it at first, but he became my companion, my comfort, and every time I looked at him, I saw Helen's love for me reflected in his eyes. Buddy was a part of our life together, and after Henry died, well, I thought maybe Buddy could bring me some peace, just as he had brought Henry peace." Margaret's mind was spinning. The connection between Henry, Thomas, and Buddy was more intricate than she could have ever imagined. Her husband's kindness had stretched beyond their own family, had reached into the life of a grieving man, and now it was reaching her. It was as though Henry's spirit, his legacy, had been passed on through Buddy, guiding her in ways she couldn't fully understand. Margaret looked down at Buddy, who was sitting calmly at her feet, his eyes soft and understanding. It was then that the full weight of the revelation hit her. Buddy hadn't just wandered into her life by accident. He hadn't simply been a stray dog, looking for shelter from the storm. No, there was a reason Buddy had come to her. It was as though fate had brought him to her doorstep, as though Henry's kindness had woven its way through time and space, pulling Buddy into her life. When she needed him most, tears welled in Margaret's eyes as the realization dawned on her. Buddy wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol, a living embodiment of Henry's love, his compassion, and his unspoken legacy. Buddy was carrying with him the very essence of Henry's spirit, a spirit that had transcended death and found its way to Margaret in her time of grief. She reached down and stroked Buddy's head, the tears falling freely now. "You're not just a dog, are you?" she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "You're a reminder, a gift from Henry, a bridge to a love that never really left." Buddy looked up at her, his tail wagging gently, as if he understood everything she was saying. Margaret could feel the warmth of his presence, the comfort he brought, and the healing that was slowly starting to take root in her broken heart. For the first time in a long while, Margaret didn't feel so alone. She had been given a gift, a second chance at love, at connection, at healing. Thomas watched her with a quiet understanding in his eyes. "I'm glad Buddy found his way to you, Margaret. I think Henry would have wanted it that way." Margaret smiled through her tears, a sense of peace washing over her. "I think so too, Thomas," she said softly. "I think so too." And as the two of them sat in the care facility room, with Buddy by their side, it felt as though the past and the present had come together, bringing them all a step closer to the healing they so desperately needed. The truth had been uncovered, and with it, a life-changing revelation, sometimes the most profound. Connections are the ones we least expect. The days following Margaret's revelation were quieter, yet somehow filled with a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The heavy weight of grief that had consumed her life for so long had begun to lift, and in its place was something softer, more gentle, a quiet comfort. She still missed Henry, and perhaps she always would. But now, it felt as if a part of him was still with her, in Buddy, in the memories they shared, in the connection that had been rekindled. Margaret spent the next few weeks visiting Thomas regularly, often bringing Buddy with her. Each time they met, the bond between them deepened. It wasn't just a bond formed out of shared loss, but one rooted in the understanding of what it meant to heal, to find hope after heartache. It was a healing that seemed to grow stronger every day, nurtured by the unconditional love that Buddy gave so freely, as if he were the embodiment of the peace they both longed for. One afternoon, as Margaret and Thomas sat together in the small garden outside the care facility, sipping tea, they began to share more of their stories, of the days before their losses, of the lives they had once known. Thomas spoke of Helen with a tenderness that made Margaret's heart ache. He described their life together with such detail, as if he could still see her in the quiet spaces of the room, hear her laughter in the breeze that rustled the leaves. Margaret listened intently, offering her own stories in return, the small moments she had cherished. With Henry, their quiet evenings at home, the laughter they had shared despite the weight of their busy lives, they found solace in each other's company, the shared grief somehow binding them together, offering them both a sense of closure they hadn't realized they needed. And as the days turned into weeks, Margaret began to feel a new sense of purpose growing within her. The healing that Buddy had brought into her life was undeniable. He had eased her pain, calmed the storm inside her heart, and reminded her that love could still be found even in the darkest of times. But there was something more that Margaret had to do, something that had been stirring inside her since her visit to the abandoned house, since she had uncovered the truth about Henry's connection to Thomas. She had spent years in mourning, lost in her grief, but now she felt an urge to take the love she had received and give it back to the world. She had spent so much time mourning Henry, but perhaps it was time to honor him in a way that would make him proud, to take the kindness he had always shown others and spread it just as he had. And so, Margaret made a decision that felt both profound and simple. She would adopt Buddy officially. He was no longer just a dog that had wandered into her life by chance. He was family. And she would care for him, love him, and cherish him for as long as he lived. Margaret's decision to adopt Buddy was only the beginning. She knew that her own healing was far from complete, and she wanted to make sure that the comfort Buddy had brought her would be shared with others who were struggling. Inspired by the love and support Buddy had given her, Margaret decided to volunteer at a local animal shelter. It was a place where she could channel her grief into something productive, where she could help other animals in need just as Buddy had needed her. And it was a way for her to honor Henry, to keep his legacy alive in a way that was meaningful and impactful. The shelter became a place of solace for Margaret, a place where she could give back and find purpose in helping those who, like Buddy, had been lost and forgotten. Each day, as she worked with the animals, she found herself growing stronger. She began to see the world in a different light, one filled with hope, filled with possibility. And each time she saw an animal find a new home, a new family, she felt a sense of peace that she had longed for during her darkest days. The final chapter of Margaret's journey was written one quiet morning in the park, as the sun rose gently over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. Margaret stood at the entrance of the park, Buddy by her side, his tail wagging with excitement as he looked up at her. For the first time in years, Margaret smiled, a true smile, a smile that came from deep within her heart. It was a smile of peace, of acceptance, of closure. She took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs, and started walking, her pace steady and sure. Buddy trotted along beside her, occasionally glancing up at her with that familiar, trusting look in his eyes. It felt as though the world had shifted, as if everything that had once seemed impossible, her healing, her sense of purpose, her ability to move forward, was now within reach. As they reached the center of the park, Margaret stopped and looked up at the sky. The clouds had parted, and the sun's rays bathed the world in a soft, golden light. For a moment, everything felt still, as if time had stopped just for her, just for this moment of quiet reflection. Margaret stood there, her heart full of gratitude, her soul finally at peace. "Thank you, Henry," she whispered softly, her voice carried away by the breeze. "Thank you for everything." Buddy stopped at her feet, looking up at her as if he understood. He gave a small bark, wagging his tail with joy. Margaret laughed softly, the sound of it mingling with the rustling of the leaves in the trees. She reached down and patted Buddy's head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers. He had brought her so much comfort, so much healing, and in return, she would give him the life he deserved, a life filled with love, with care, with belonging. As she stood there, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin, Margaret realized that her grief had not been erased. It would never be, but it had transformed. It had become something different, something she could live with. The love she had lost had given way to new beginnings, and with Buddy by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that love, in all its forms, was a gift that could never be taken away. And so, Margaret and Buddy continued their walk through the park, the past behind them and the future ahead, full of promise and hope.